Hello everyone, enjoy your viewing.
My name is Doris Clayton, and I never imagined at 73 that I'd be in this situation. I've lived a long life, raised a family, worked hard, and always been there for them when they needed me. But somehow, in the last few years, something changed. Something I didn't see coming. I've always believed that family was the most important thing. I've spent my entire life giving, caring, and supporting my children. All I ever wanted was to be close to them, to help them in any way I could. When I was younger, I thought love meant being there for your children in every way, from diaper changes to school pickups, to late-night heart-to-hearts. And I gave all of that without hesitation. But what I didn't anticipate was that love, in the eyes of some, can become a transaction. One day you wake up to find that instead of being loved for who you are, you're being loved for what you can provide. I was always proud of my son Robert. From the day he was born, I poured my heart into raising him. As a little boy, he would hold my hand tightly, and I'd tell him how proud I was of him. Later, as a young man, he worked hard to become a doctor. I was always so proud of his achievements. He was my pride, my joy. I'd always thought he'd be the one to take care of me in my old age. Then, of course, there was Karen, his wife. First, I liked her well enough. She was warm, friendly, and seemed to care for Robert in a way that made me feel reassured. But over time, things changed. She began to change. She became more involved in social media, more focused on her image, less interested in the real-life struggles of those around her. I watched as she became obsessed with building a life on Instagram. Perfect photos, perfectly staged dinners, and a life that seemed flawless. The woman I thought I knew had become someone else entirely. And then it happened. They asked me to move in with them. "We've got this new house, Doris. It's perfect for all of us. We want you to come live with us close to the kids." "It'll be great," Robert had said, his voice full of excitement. At the time, it seemed like the perfect solution. I had always wanted to be close to my grandchildren, to be part of their everyday lives. And they promised me a space in their home, my own room, my own place in their family. It sounded too good to resist. I packed up my things and moved in. I thought I was doing something good, something right. But it didn't take long for me to realize I had made a mistake. First, it was subtle. Little things that slipped under the radar. Helping with the kids, cleaning up after meals, running errands. All the while, Karen would smile at me, pat my hand, and say how grateful she was for my help. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. Slowly, very slowly, I became invisible in their eyes. I wasn't a mother, I wasn't a grandmother, I was just another part of the furniture. Started with the kids. At first, they were delighted to have me around. They loved having their grandmother close by, and I enjoyed spending time with them, watching them grow. But then, as Karen's social media presence grew, so did her demands. It became clear that my role was no longer that of a loving grandmother. It was more of a servant. Karen began to treat me like one, and Robert, well, he wasn't any better. He didn't notice. He never noticed. I became the one who took care of everything. The cooking, the cleaning, the childcare. It was as if they'd forgotten I was a person. Someone with needs, someone who wanted to be appreciated. Every time I tried to talk to Robert about how I was feeling, he would brush it off. "Karen is just stressed, Mom. You know how she is," he would say. And I did know. But that didn't make it okay. The final straw came one afternoon when Karen, in front of her friends, threw a dirty rag at my feet and told me to clean the floor. Her voice was sharp, condescending, as if she were addressing an employee. "Wipe the floor, Nanny," she'd said, laughing as though it were a joke. Her friends giggled, but I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My heart dropped, my blood boiled. I was humiliated, crushed. But something inside me snapped. No longer was I going to sit quietly and play the role of the invisible grandmother. I had spent too many years helping, giving, and sacrificing. I had been the one to take care of everyone else, to put their needs above my own. But in that moment, I realized that I had been taken for granted. It was time to take back control. I made a decision that day, a decision that would change everything. I would no longer be the invisible woman in the background. I wouldn't stand idly by while they walked all over me. I had given them everything, my time, my money, my love, and what had I received in return? Nothing but scorn. I stopped helping. I refused to cook, to clean, to look after the kids. I didn't even bother to pick up the phone when Robert called, asking me to come back to help. Slowly, the house began to descend into chaos. The kids couldn't find their things, meals were late, and the place began to look like what it was: a home without a foundation. That's when Karen tried to intervene. She came to me, looking frazzled and desperate. "Doris, I know things have been tough, but you're part of the family. We need you." But it was too late for apologies. I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to be their servant anymore. I began to document everything. Every moment of humiliation, every cruel comment, every way they took advantage of me. I wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. And when the time came when they realized that nothing in their house worked without me, I would be ready. I would make them see the truth. They would regret the day they ever thought they could treat me like this. I wasn't just a grandmother anymore. I was a force, and they were about to learn that the hard way. Every day I became more resolute. Karen, without a doubt, did not expect my resistance. She thought she could keep me on a leash, pretending to be kind and caring, all the while using me as cheap labor. But the more she humiliated me, the more I realized that my patience wasn't a weakness. It was my strategic silence, a silence that would one day turn into her defeat. One morning I woke up and realized I could wait no longer. I sat at the kitchen table, watching as once again Karen stood in the hallway with her phone, Instagramming her latest carefree cup of coffee with milk, while my grandchildren ran around the house, unable to find their textbooks. Instead of asking me where they had left their things, they called for me like I was a cook or a nanny. That was the last straw. The next day, after I had turned off the stove after lunch, I just sat there in my spot, observing them. They all sat down at the table again, and their demands began to sound even more demanding. But I knew the time had come. I was no longer going to follow their orders without question. And so I did it. Karen was standing next to me, laughing at her latest social media story, when I approached her. "What now?" She didn't lift her eyes from the screen. "I'm not going to cook, clean, or take care of the kids anymore, Karen," I said coldly, not breaking my gaze. "It's no longer my job." She raised her eyes, and her face twisted in surprise, then irritation. She approached me, choosing every word carefully, trying to control the situation. "Mom, don't start, we do so much for you," she said, trying to appear innocent. "For me." I met her gaze firmly. "You took my home, my money, and now you disrespect me? You can continue pretending that I'm your shadow, but I can't take it anymore." Karen stood in silence, her mouth opening and closing, but she couldn't find the words to respond. I knew she was angry. Her perfect little world was beginning to crumble. She looked as though she was trying to comprehend what had just happened, but her social persona, all of it, was crumbling in front of her eyes. The next day, I decided it was time to talk to Robert. I knew my words couldn't just be outbursts of anger anymore. Now I needed determination. During dinner, when we were left alone, I said, "I'm not going to play along with their game anymore, Robert. You can't keep pretending you don't see this." "What do you mean?" Robert tried to appear calm, but I could see he was nervous. "They've just used me. Karen insults me at every chance. Don't you see that? You don't even react to it." I saw his face change. My words hit straight to the heart of what he didn't want to see. For all these years I had supported their family, and now I was outside their plans. At that moment I realized I had made a decision. I wasn't just fighting for respect anymore. I was going to change the entire game. My next steps were going to be far-reaching, and soon everyone would know exactly where I stood. That night I laid in bed, my thoughts racing. I couldn't wait any longer. I had given enough, sacrificed enough. If they wanted to play this game, then I would play it too, but on my terms. Robert's response wasn't what I had hoped for. It was the same old excuse, the same indifferent shrug. "Mom, it's just Karen. She's stressed. You know how she is." The words stung, but they also solidified my resolve. This was no longer about making things better for them. It was about me finally taking control of my life again. I couldn't sit back and be used, silenced by their convenience any longer. The next few days passed in a quiet storm of tension. At every meal, I resisted helping in the usual way. I didn't go out of my way to make sure the house stayed in order, or that the kids had everything they needed. I wasn't going to be their unpaid help anymore. Karen noticed it almost immediately, but instead of confronting me directly, she became passive-aggressive. She would make little comments as though she were doing me a favor. Oh, Doris, I'm so sorry to ask you this, but could you please help with the kids again? They're really getting behind on their schoolwork. But I said nothing. I just let the chaos unfold around me. I didn't get involved. And as the days passed, I could see the cracks in their perfect world. The house grew messier, the kids more scattered, and Karen's online persona began to waver. She wasn't posting her usual perfect family meals or meticulously staged shots of happiness. There was too much noise in the house now. The air was thick with frustration, and it was clear to me that this would be the moment that tipped the scale. It wasn't long before Karen snapped. One evening, as I was sitting in my room, she stormed in. Her face was red, her hands clenched into fists. Why aren't you helping? The house is falling apart and I can't do it all myself, she yelled. I'm not your servant, Karen, I replied evenly. I didn't come here to be your maid or your nanny. You're going to have to figure it out yourself. Her face contorted with disbelief, as though she couldn't fathom that I had stopped caring. What is wrong with you, Doris? Why are you doing this? I'm doing this because I've had enough, I said, standing my ground. I'm not going to let you treat me this way anymore. You've used me for too long and now I'm done. For a moment she just stared at me, not knowing what to say. But I knew that this moment was the beginning of the end for her little facade. Her perfect life was about to crumble, and I wasn't going to be there to hold it up anymore. That night after she left, I sat quietly. The house felt different, quieter. The silence was empowering. I had taken my first step, and now I was on a path that could not be undone. The next phase of my plan was already taking shape. I wasn't just going to stop doing things for them, I was going to make sure they understood why. I was going to make them realize what they had been taking for granted. But this wasn't just about getting back at them. This was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my worth. And if they wanted to play hardball, I was ready for it. I wasn't afraid anymore. The morning after, I woke up with a clear purpose in my mind. I decided that the time had come, not just to protect my dignity, but to reclaim my independence. I wasn't going to be a part of this show any longer. My strength didn't lie in silence, it lay in action. I started by gathering all the documents. When I sold my home, I had transferred a huge sum of money to them, the result of 40 years of hard work. There were no written agreements, only verbal ones. But that didn't matter. I knew I had the power to change things. I contacted a lawyer, explaining everything to him, from the beginning to the end. My actions weren't meant to be just an emotional outburst. This was a carefully thought-out strategy. While I prepared my next steps, Karen continued to play her game. She was constantly laughing, posting about how hard it was to be a mom and a woman who controlled everything. But every time I looked at her, I saw more and more cracks in her perfect image. All her Instagram photos flawless, each tiny detail meticulously thought out. But I knew that in real life, everything was completely different. She was becoming more and more nervous, trying to reinforce her position, but I couldn't have cared less. I was ready to take matters into my own hands. I began to withdraw from all my duties, but that was only the first step. I was no longer going to be the shadow. My actions were becoming more and more decisive. I realized that I had every right to my own part of life, to my independence, and that this wasn't just a fight for my dignity. It was a fight for the future of my grandchildren. One evening, I decided to confront Robert. I knew my words couldn't just be outbursts of anger anymore. Now I needed clarity. During dinner, when we were alone, I said, "Am I really going to stand by, or are you going to stay in the shadow of your wife once again? You need to know, Robert, I will no longer be a spectator in this." He didn't answer immediately. His eyes were full of uncertainty because he didn't know what to do. He had gotten used to conflict between us, but he didn't want to admit it. "I don't know what to say, but I don't want you to start a war," he finally admitted. "The war has already begun, Robert, and it wasn't my choice. I won't stay silent anymore. I'm losing my dignity, my family, my role. For what?" I asked him, not knowing if I would get an answer. In the end, I understood. He wasn't ready to fight, not even for himself. But I was. Now I moved to the next stage. I started to collect evidence. Every phone call, every condescending word from Karen, every moment when Robert didn't stand up for me. I recorded everything I could. Meanwhile, Karen, unaware that I was already preparing for retaliation, continued to show off her perfect image online. However, the more she tried to present herself as the super mom, the more disconnected from reality she became. As soon as I stopped helping, chaos broke out at home. The kids lacked attention, meals weren't cooked, and Karen couldn't maintain the image she had so carefully constructed. I knew this was just the beginning. It was time for a clear and decisive strategy, and I was ready for any consequences that came my way. I decided that I would no longer stand by and wait. My role in their lives had changed, but this time it wasn't me who had to change. I began to take active steps to regain control over my own destiny. The first step was to restore justice. I contacted my lawyer, explained the entire situation, and we began working on a plan. My notes and my records became serious evidence. Karen and Robert had no idea that I had already gathered proof of their careless treatment. I prepared a legal strategy, and now they were going to understand that they couldn't just get rid of me like that. One evening, I sat in my room when I received a message from Robert. He wrote, "Mom, I want to talk about everything you said. I need to understand this." I looked at his words and realized that he was afraid of losing the comfort that Karen provided him. But that no longer mattered to me. I decided I would meet him when I was ready to tell him the whole truth. Meanwhile, Karen continued her game. She looked like the perfect mother to her followers, completely forgetting about reality. She continued posting pictures with the kids, portraying herself as the embodiment of motherhood, while all she did was manipulate people to boost her popularity. She even smiled for the camera while I cooked dinner and cared for the grandchildren like some servant. She kept saying, "I always do everything myself." And I realized that all of this was simply her fabricated story for social media. When I met with Robert, he once again looked as if he didn't understand why this was happening. "Mom, I don't understand why you're doing this. We're family. I don't want things to fall apart," he asked again, tiredly looking at me. I didn't let him avoid answering. I had to tell him the truth even if it sounded harsh. "You can't keep your eyes closed, Robert. I am not just supposed to be the background in your life. I didn't sell my home to become your free maid. I will no longer stay silent," I said, my voice firm like never before. Robert flinched at my words. His eyes were filled with sadness and shame. He fell silent, ignoring my tears. From that moment on, I understood that I had to do this for myself, not for him. I decided to act quickly. Gathering all my strength, I went back to the lawyer and prepared a lawsuit. My next steps left no room for compromise. This was the moment when I realized I would no longer wait for someone to come and change my life. I would be the change. The consequences of my actions didn't take long to show. Karen began to notice that it was getting harder for her to maintain the perfect image. Her posts became less appealing, and followers began to ask questions. She didn't realize that my move was just the beginning, but I wasn't leaving them without a lesson. I started my silent war for my place in the family. Every day, Karen became more frantic. I could see it in the way she acted, her fake smiles, her forced captions. Her world was cracking, and all the while I stayed quiet, letting her think everything was fine. But it wasn't. The cracks in her facade were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing crumbled. Meanwhile, Robert continued to hesitate. He didn't want to confront the truth. He wanted to keep playing the role of the good son, the one who didn't have to choose between his wife and his mother. But I had already made my choice. I had chosen myself. It was in the moments of silence that I found my strength. The more Karen posted her perfect life online, the more I watched from the sidelines, knowing the truth. The children were neglected, meals were not prepared, and the chaos was growing behind the scenes. Yet Karen continued to play the perfect mom for her followers, unaware that every post she made, every perfect picture she shared, was becoming more and more hollow. I knew the time had come to push back. I would not allow myself to be treated like a doormat anymore. I had given them everything, my home, my money, my time, and all I received in return was disrespect. No more. So I started my fight. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was a quiet, purposeful rebellion. I refused to play her game. I stopped helping. I stopped cleaning. I stopped cooking. I watched as the house descended into chaos, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen would be forced to face the reality of what she had been doing. But I wasn't just going to let them deal with the fallout alone. I had a plan, and I would make sure it worked. My lawyer had already laid the groundwork for the lawsuit, and now it was time to act. I was going to make sure that they understood the cost of their actions, that nothing in life comes without consequences. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly free. The weight of their expectations was lifting, and I was beginning to feel like myself again. I knew I had to be patient, but the fire inside me was burning brighter than ever. I was going to show them all that I was more than just the background in their lives. I was a force to be reckoned with, and they were going to learn that the hard way. As Karen scrambled to keep up appearances, I focused on what mattered. I no longer needed their validation. I no longer needed their approval. I was standing on my own 2 feet, and for the first time in a long time I felt powerful. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to back down. The silent war had begun, and I was ready for whatever came next. The next few days were pivotal. I could no longer turn back. My determination had become unwavering, and I had no intention of tolerating the disrespect any longer. While Karen continued her efforts to maintain the illusion of a perfect family for her followers, I took the first decisive step toward change. I already had a plan in place that would no longer allow her to manipulate me. The lawyer had contacted Karen and Robert, informing them that I had filed a lawsuit. They had no idea that I had gone this far. This wasn't just a legal move. It was a signal that I would no longer allow them to use me as a tool for their own comfort. Robert immediately called me, and I could hear the tremor in his voice, as if he were a little boy afraid of his mother's wrath. "Mom, what are you doing? You can't take everything. This isn't right. It will destroy our family." His voice echoed with despair. "We don't have a family if you allow Karen to make me your silent shadow, Robert. This isn't love. It's manipulation. I will not be silent any longer." I responded, my voice cold and unrelenting. There was a silence between us, heavy as concrete. He seemed to be trying to understand why I had so resolutely defended my dignity. But there was no time for reflection. He could no longer pull me back into the role of a weak grandmother who tolerates everything. From that moment, I knew I would leave them to their path of destruction if it came to that. Karen, realizing her perfect world had started to crack, tried to calm the situation in another way. She approached me, attempting to manipulate with words. "You don't want this, Mom, we've done so much for you." But now her words sounded like empty promises. I had become so determined that I was no longer willing to listen to these hollow statements. I responded coldly, "No, Karen. Now I will do what is right for me." For all these years I had worked for their comfort, built their life, and now it was my turn to be at the center of things. I had decided to take care of my future, my place in the family. And in that moment I realized that no matter what it cost me, I had to take back what was rightfully mine. And I would. Meanwhile, their perfect picture began to fall apart. In the house where I had once wiped floors, picked up toys and cooked meals, chaos began to set in. The kids could no longer find their things, the meals at the table became less and less refined, and Karen desperately tried to compensate for it in every possible way, not realizing that her fake world would soon come crashing down. I wasn't ready to give up. My strategy began to bear fruit. As I watched their world slowly unravel, I could see Karen trying to keep up the charade. She posted pictures of her perfect family on social media, pretending everything was fine, but I knew the truth. The kids were neglected. She was overwhelmed, and she was starting to lose control. Each post, each perfect photograph she shared was a thin veil hiding the growing cracks in her life. She had built her brand on lies, and now those lies were starting to fall apart. I wasn't sure what the final straw would be, but I knew it was coming. I was prepared. I had taken my own steps to protect my future and my dignity, and I had no intention of letting them undo everything I had worked for. I had already begun to take back control. I had stopped being the invisible grandmother in the background. I had become someone who would make them see the truth. No more pretending, no more silence. Robert, caught between his wife and his mother, was starting to understand the weight of his choices. He called me again, this time with a bit more urgency. "Mom, can we talk? I need to understand why you're doing this. I need to understand why this is happening." His words were heavy with guilt and confusion, but I wasn't about to let him backtrack. He had chosen his comfort for too long. "You don't get it, Robert," I said firmly. I didn't sell my house to become a maid in your perfect little world. I'm done pretending. I'm not going to be used anymore." There was a long pause and I could feel him struggling with my words. But I wasn't interested in saving him from the hard truth anymore. I wasn't here to make him feel comfortable. I was here to make him face the consequences of his inaction, of letting Karen turn me into a servant. But while Robert remained trapped in his indecision, Karen was running out of time. She could no longer control the narrative. I was no longer willing to remain a passive observer. The game had changed. It wasn't about playing by their rules anymore. It was about taking back the control I had given away for too long. I had been watching them carefully. The cracks were becoming more and more visible. I knew their perfect life was slipping, but I wasn't going to let them pretend anymore. I was preparing for the next stage, a stage where they could no longer escape their actions. The lawsuit was just the beginning. This wasn't just about money or control. This was about showing them that I wasn't a helpless grandmother, but a woman who had a voice, who had fought for everything she had, and was no longer afraid to take what was hers. The days that followed were marked by a quiet but powerful tension. I knew it wasn't over yet, but I was no longer sitting back and watching their lives crumble. I was making sure they understood the price of their actions. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the truth coming to light. And Karen, Robert, and their fragile world were about to see it all unfold. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of my room, watching the entire house descend into chaos, I realized that I now held everything under control. Karen had been growing more and more tense, trying desperately to maintain her perfect image for social media. But I could see how difficult it was for her. She was starting to snap over little things, not being able to find her phone, not having enough time to prepare dinner, and struggling to manage the kids. All her energy was going into sustaining a facade, and I saw her unraveling before my eyes. It was in that moment that I knew her perfect world was crumbling. I watched as she tried to keep everything under control, but her nerves, her frustrated looks, everything about her gave her away. She couldn't keep up the balance between the image she created in the online world and the reality I was helping her hide. But I was no longer just a silent observer. My next move was planned, and I knew it would pay off. The next day, when Karen and Robert went off to yet another Instagram-worthy party with their friends, I stayed at home. The kids, of course, stayed with me, and I couldn't just sit idly by. While they were at the celebration, I went straight to Robert and Karen's room. Looking around at their mess, I noticed another detail: a complete lack of privacy. They hadn't even bothered to hide their financial documents. This was my opportunity. I quickly glanced at their open computer, and to my surprise, there they were, all the important papers I had been looking for. Their loans, debts, and documents that confirmed just how deep they were in financial trouble. This wasn't just a chance, it was my salvation. I made several copies and saved them on a flash drive. Meanwhile, chaos reigned in the house. The kids scattered their toys, and I tried to tidy up when suddenly the door opened and Karen walked in, her face filled with nervous tension. "Couldn't you just leave things as they were, Doris?" Her voice was cold, but I could see she was rattled. "Leave it? When your whole perfection is falling apart, and you're trying to keep up the show. That's not my problem, Karen," I said calmly, though inside, everything was boiling over. Karen tried again to change the tone. She began asking questions, carefully selecting her words as if she thought we could fix everything. But I already knew. Nothing could be fixed. They thought they could control me, leave me in the shadows, but their false world was no longer holding up. I was ready to act. And then, just as Karen seemed on the verge of desperation, I pulled out the flash drive with all of her financial documents and placed it on the table. Her eyes widened when she saw that I knew more than she had thought. "Did you think I couldn't do this?" I looked at her, and my words felt like a final verdict. "This isn't. You don't have the right." Her voice turned hoarse, laced with malicious panic. "Right? No, Karen, I have the right. And I also have the right to my dignity, the dignity you tried to strip away. I'm no longer going to be your shadow. And you'll realize that very soon." In that moment, I knew nothing could be changed now. My next move was just a matter of time. The weight of the situation was undeniable. Karen's facade was shattered. She tried to hide her fear, but it was evident in the way her hands trembled as she reached for the documents. She had thought she could continue playing her game, pulling the strings, making me her pawn. But she was wrong. The power had shifted. The balance had tipped in my favor. Robert's inability to step up for me had finally led to his wife's downfall, and now Karen was facing the consequences of her actions. I had always been the strong one, the one who held the family together. And now I was taking back control of my life, my future, and my dignity. Karen stood there, her eyes wide, trying to figure out what to do next, but she couldn't. She had no more lies to hide behind. She had no more control over me. And Robert, well, he was still lost in the middle of it all. He didn't know how to fix things because for the first time he couldn't. This wasn't about trying to make everyone happy anymore. It was about making sure I was heard. You think you can control everything, Karen, but you're wrong. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everything you've taken for granted, I said, watching her as the realization settled in. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She had nothing left to say. I was done letting them call the shots. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my place in this family, and I was ready for whatever came next. The next part of the plan was set in motion, and I had no intention of stopping. I knew I wasn't just fighting for my dignity. I was fighting for the truth, and I would make sure they all knew it. The final chapter of my story was already on the doorstep. I could feel it in every movement I made, in every word I spoke, in every look I gave Karen. All those years of silence, of patience and self-sacrifice, they had been nothing more than preparation for this moment. I was ready to take the final step, the one that would change everything. After I placed the documents on the table, Karen stood frozen in front of me, her hands trembling, her face pale with fear. She tried to argue, desperately fumbling for words, but I didn't listen. I no longer cared what she thought. Do you really want me to stay silent? I said, my words barely grazing her. You won't see me as a victim anymore. You've disrespected me, and this will have consequences. I could see her mask cracking. She was no longer the calm, smiling blogger she tried to present to the world. Before me stood someone who could see her fake world crumbling, and she didn't know what to do. I placed my hand on my phone and dialed my lawyer's number. Prepare the lawsuit. They will pay for what they've done, I said, and I knew this was no longer just a threat. Karen began to pour out excuses, trying to talk her way out of it. She tried to manipulate my emotions, using pitiful phrases about the kids, about how she never wanted this to happen. But all I heard was empty noise. I wasn't the grandmother who worried about family ties anymore. I was a woman who knew her worth, and I wasn't going to let myself be manipulated anymore. Robert returned that evening. I saw the same question in his eyes. What's next? He tried to play the mediator, but his face betrayed that he no longer believed in this fake world. Next comes justice, Robert, I said. You'll see what you truly deserve. I no longer expected their understanding. I knew that the hardest stage was coming. The battle for what was real and important. My actions were quiet but certain. I reached out to the lawyer to begin the process of reclaiming my money. I filed a lawsuit for breach of contract and emotional distress. I demanded compensation for everything I had given them, and more. The following week, Karen and Robert learned that their perfect home would be put up for sale. Their business, their status, everything they had tried to build on my money was crumbling. They couldn't believe I was truly prepared to go all the way. But I was no longer the one to back down. 2 months later, when their house was sold, and the debts were paid, I sat in my new modest but cozy home. It wasn't big, but I felt free, no longer tied to manipulation and lies. And most importantly, I had left behind the toxic world that had tried to strip away my dignity. My son Robert eventually admitted his mistakes, but by then it didn't matter to me if he apologized. I no longer needed their justifications or sympathy. Now I could breathe again. I had regained my dignity, my self-respect, and a future for my grandchildren. And this was the true victorious moment. The moment when I stopped being part of someone else's game and became the author of my own story. And you know what? I wasn't afraid anymore. Now I was ready to defend myself to the very end.
Thanks for watching. Bye bye.